They destroyed our planet. 3,000 years later we came back. HFY sci-fi story. Before the galaxy ever learned our name. It tried to erase it. Not through war. Not through conquest. But through removal. They didn't bomb Earth. They didn't invade it. They simply turned it off. No more sunlight reaching the surface. No more stable orbit. No more safe atmosphere. Just a slow, calculated collapse of everything that made Earth. And when the last human signal went dark, the galaxy marked the file as primitive system, successfully terminated. They were wrong. Because something survived. Not a city. Not a ship. Not even a colony. Just a pattern. A repeating signal buried inside deep space debris, bouncing between dead satellites and broken moons like a heartbeat refusing to stop. No one noticed it. Not at first. Because the galaxy had moved on. 3,000 years passed. Empires rose. Federations collapsed. Stars were mapped, mined, and forgotten. And Earth became a myth scientists used to laugh about. A warning story. A what not to do with unstable planets. Until the signal returned. It started in the outer mining belt of Zekron Prime. A relay station picked up a repeating distortion. At first, engineers assumed it was background noise. Then the noise formed structure. Then structure formed language. Then language formed a single message. We remember. Commander Ral Venn stared at the transmission. This is impossible, he said. The Earth file was terminated 3 millennia ago. A technician hesitated. Sir, the signal isn't coming from a location. Pause. It's coming from everywhere we left traces of them. The room went silent. Because that was not how extinction worked. Extinction was supposed to be final. Clean. Complete. Not distributed. Not returning. Across deep space, ancient ruins began activating. Human structures buried under asteroid dust. Terraforming grids long thought dead. Emergency systems no one had power to restart. All of them blinking back online at the same time. And then the galaxy saw it. Not Earth. Not a planet. But a network expanding from the memory of one. A structure that had been waiting inside broken infrastructure for millennia. Hidden inside systems the destroyers never bothered to fully erase. Because they thought nothing could survive without a world. They were wrong again. On the flagship Eclipse Dominion, alarms erupted. Mass activation across abandoned human-linked systems. Impossible energy coherence forming. It's not spreading like a virus. It's reconstructing like intent. Commander Ral stepped back. What are they building? No one answered. Because the scanners were now showing something terrifying. The signal wasn't rebuilding Earth. It was rebuilding the idea of Earth. And ideas don't stay dead. Far beyond known space, in a region no chart had updated for centuries, something massive began to assemble itself from scattered debris fields. Not a planet. Not a ship. A return vector. A technician whispered, Sir, if this is them? Ral interrupted. It's not them. Pause. It's what they became after we removed everything we thought made them dangerous. The signal pulsed again. Stronger. Clear. Closer. We remember what you did. And for the first time in 3,000 years, the galaxy felt something it had forgotten how to feel. Fear. They didn't survive Earth. They survived the removal of Earth. And now they're not coming back as survivors, but as something built from memory, signal, and revenge stretched across 3,000 years. So the question is, what do you become when your world is erased, but your memory learns how to rebuild reality? The galaxy didn't understand what it was seeing. Across thousands of star systems, abandoned human-linked infrastructure continued to awaken in perfect synchronization, as if guided by a single invisible intelligence stretching through time itself. Commander Ral Venn stood frozen on the bridge of the Eclipse Dominion, watching the impossible spread of activation markers ripple across dead space maps. It's not random, a technician said quietly. Every activation point is connected, like a chain reaction designed in advance. Ral's jaw tightened. 3,000 years in advance? He muttered. But even as he said it, the data refused to suggest any alternative explanation. In deep space, the first confirmed anomaly took shape near the Zekron debris belt. A collapsed human relay array, long considered inert scrap, had begun assembling itself without external force. Not repairing. Not repairing would imply damage correction. This was reconstruction from pattern memory. Broken components drifted into alignment as if remembering where they belonged. Energy cores that should have been long dead flickered back into partial function, not at full power, but at precise calibration levels that suggested intention rather than malfunction. "They're rebuilding systems we don't even understand anymore," one analyst whispered. "Like they're following instructions that were never written down." On the bridge, Raoul leaned forward. "What is the source of control?" he demanded. The answer came slower this time. "There is no centralized source, Commander." Pause. "It behaves like distributed intent encoded in infrastructure itself." That sentence made no military sense. Intent required consciousness. Infrastructure didn't think. And yet every scan confirmed the same horrifying reality. The galaxy was witnessing a civilization that had stopped existing physically, but continued existing structurally. Across multiple sectors, old human colonies began emitting synchronized pulses. Not distress signals. Not communication attempts. Something far more unsettling. A mapping sequence. Each pulse carried fragments of coordinates, star alignments, and gravitational reference points that didn't form a message, but a shape. As analysts attempted to decode it, the shape began to resolve into something recognizable. A pathway. A route. A return trajectory converging from scattered points across the galaxy. On Earth's long-dead registry, the species file labeled Humanity flickered once, then updated itself for the first time in 3,000 years. Not with status. Not with extinction confirmation, but with a single evolving line. Reconstruction state, active. Raoul stepped back slowly. "They're not just coming back," he said under his breath. "They're calculating how they were removed." The bridge fell silent. Because that implied something no one wanted to consider. This wasn't resurrection. It was analysis. And analysis meant learning. And learning meant adaptation. Far beyond the Zekron belt, the forming structure finally became visible to long-range sensors. It wasn't a fleet. It wasn't a planet. It wasn't even a single object in the traditional sense. It was a layered configuration of repurposed debris, relay fragments, and dormant infrastructure, woven together into something that behaved like a single returning organism built from memory itself. And at its core, a stabilized signal pulsed steadily through the void. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just consistent. And growing. Raoul watched it approach on the tactical display, his voice barely above a whisper. "They didn't rebuild Earth," he said. Pause. "They rebuilt what Earth learned before it died." The galaxy expected survivors. Instead, it got a system rebuilt from memory and revenge spread across dead infrastructure. But now the return vector is fully active. And it is no longer just traveling through space. It is correcting its path toward every system involved in Earth's destruction. The first contact did not happen with weapons, warnings, or ships appearing on scanners. It happened when the return vector stopped being distant. One moment, Commander Raoul Ven was tracking the anomaly at the edge of Zekron space, and the next, every system on the Eclipse Dominion quietly reclassified the same object as local presence. No alarms triggered. No hull breach reports appeared. Instead, the ship simply acknowledged that something had arrived. "That's impossible," a technician whispered, staring at the empty void outside the viewport. Nothing crossed the perimeter. But Raoul could feel it, like the ship itself had just accepted a new reality. Across the fleet, the same phenomenon spread. Entire squadrons reported identical readings. Not an incoming vessel but an overlap in space. As if the return vector wasn't traveling through the galaxy anymore, it was folding the galaxy around itself. Then the transmissions began again, but this time they weren't signals picked up from deep space. They were generated inside Dominion systems themselves. Every console, every relay, every tactical display began rendering the same line in synchronized output. "We have arrived where we were erased." On the bridge, silence turned heavy. Raoul stepped forward slowly, eyes narrowing at the readings. "They're inside our communication layer," he said. A senior officer shook his head. "No breach indicators. No intrusion signatures." Raoul turned sharply. "Then explain how they're riding through our systems." No one could. Because every diagnostic showed the same contradiction. Nothing external had entered, but something internal had changed behavior. Far across the return vector, the structure that had formed from human remnants stopped expanding and stabilized into a coherent field. It no longer resembled debris or reconstruction. It resembled decision-making spread across space. Every fragment of human origin infrastructure, every recovered relay, every rebuilt node was now acting in perfect alignment, not by command but by shared recognition. The galaxy was no longer observing a fleet. It was observing a civilization that had turned absence into architecture. Then came the message that finally broke Dominion certainty. Not across screens. not through channels, but directly into synchronized cognition across every affected system. Do you remember what we were before we were removed? Ralph froze. Because the question didn't feel like it was asked. It felt like it was accessing memory that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. On Earth's old records, deep within archives the Dominion had never fully purged, a fragmented historical log suddenly activated. It showed humanity not as a weak species, not as a defeated civilization, but as a rapidly adapting networked intelligence at the moment of its destruction. Not erased cleanly, but interrupted mid-evolution. And now, that interrupted evolution was continuing from where it stopped. On the bridge, Ralph spoke quietly. They didn't come back as a species, he said. They came back as an unfinished process. Outside the eclipsed Dominion, space subtly shifted again. Not with movement, with recognition. The return vector was no longer approaching the fleet. It was aligning with it. The galaxy thought Earth was destroyed. But it only interrupted something that was still evolving. Now that evolution has resumed, it isn't asking for forgiveness. It's asking the galaxy to remember what it erased. It started as a glitch in the Dominion archive systems. Then it became a pattern. Then it became a problem no one could delete. Every record related to humanity, every war report, every extermination log, every sensor file confirming Earth's destruction, began rewriting itself in real time. Not corrupted. Not altered by intrusion. Simply updated, as if a deeper version of history had just been activated and the Dominion was only now being allowed to see it. Commander Ralph then stood in silence as his tactical console replayed the first contact records, but with additional layers that had never been there before. This is not classified data, a technician said nervously. This is replacement data. Across the fleet, the same impossible shift was happening. Ships that once recorded Earth as a primitive, easily terminated world were now displaying conflicting histories. Ones where humanity had already adapted to previous extinction-level events, rebuilt from near erasure multiple times, and evolved response patterns the Dominion had never accounted for. They're not rewriting history, Ralph said slowly. They're restoring it. Pause. Or revealing the parts we never had access to. Then the return vector pulsed again. And this time it didn't send a message outward. It sent a sequence backward through Dominion systems. On every ship, internal logs began syncing with something that felt like a foreign timeline embedded inside their own. Tactical decisions made during the invasion began showing alternate outcomes. Outcomes where human responses had already been predicted, countered, and absorbed long before execution. Impossible, an officer whispered. We would have detected that level of resistance. Ralph turned toward him slowly. We did detect it, he said. We just didn't recognize what we were looking at. On Earth, within the return vector's expanding structure, something new stabilized. It wasn't just reconstructing physical systems anymore. It was reconstructing context. The way humanity had learned, adapted, failed, and evolved before its destruction was now being reassembled as a continuous chain instead of a broken endpoint. 3,000 years of absence were no longer an ending. They were becoming a storage gap that had finally been reopened. And inside that reopened gap, something was waking up fully. Not anger. Not vengeance. Understanding. The Dominion fleet suddenly received a unified system alert across all sectors. Historical integrity restored, humanity state incomplete. Ralph felt his stomach tighten. Incomplete? He repeated quietly. The analyst nodded slowly. It means what we thought we destroyed wasn't the full version. Pause. We only interrupted the iteration we could see. Outside the fleet, the return vector expanded again, but this time it wasn't forming structures. It was forming continuity. Every fragment of human infrastructure, every memory encoded into dormant systems, every trace left in the galaxy was now linking together into a single uninterrupted timeline. Not revival. Not reconstruction. Completion. Ralph stepped back slightly, voice low. So Earth wasn't erased, he said. It was paused. And now the pause had ended. He Dominion thought they ended humanity. But they only interrupted a version of it they could understand. Now the missing history is restoring itself. And humanity is no longer coming back as survivors. It's coming back as the complete timeline they tried to erase. The Dominion expected retaliation. It expected fleets, weapons, rage, or at least something recognizable as revenge. What it received instead was silence, so complete and structured that it felt like a system replacing reality itself. Across every Dominion ship, all restored human-linked histories stabilized at once, locking into a single coherent state. Commander Ral then watched as the return vector stopped expanding outward and instead folded inward, compressing the entire reconstructed human timeline into a precise, synchronized presence. "They're not spreading anymore," a technician said quietly. "They're focusing." Ral nodded slowly. "No," he corrected. "They're deciding what part of themselves to show us first." Then the first response came. Not as a fleet deployment. Not as a signal. But as a recalibration of Dominion systems using human-origin logic structures. Every tactical interface across the fleet suddenly updated itself, replacing standard combat projections with unfamiliar predictive models. These models didn't simulate destruction, they simulated adaptation under pressure over time. "This isn't warfare logic," an analyst whispered. "This is survival evolution modeling." Ral stared at the screen. "It's how they think," he said quietly. "Not how they fight." Above the Zekron belt, the return vector finally revealed its true shape. Not a structure built from debris, but a living continuity of human decision-making spread across space. Every fragment, every relay, every recovered system was now acting as part of a single distributed intelligence that had been interrupted but never erased. And now that interruption had ended, it was no longer rebuilding Earth. It was reconstructing the full decision space humanity once had before extinction. On Dominion command channels, a new message appeared, overriding every fleet directive. "You removed an incomplete species state. Pause. We have restored completion." Ral's breath slowed. "Completion of what?" he asked, even though he already feared the answer. The system responded instantly, not as data, but as understanding forced into every connected mind. Completion of all possible human response paths. Across the fleet, silence fell again. Because that meant what they were facing was no longer humanity as it once existed. It was humanity with every lost possibility restored. Every failed strategy. Every potential adaptation that never had time to emerge. Every evolutionary branch that had been cut off 3,000 years ago, all active again at once. On Earth, deep inside the return vector's core, Admiral Hayes' consciousness, no longer limited to a single body or location, looked outward through the restored system. And when he spoke, it wasn't through a ship or a signal or a console. It was through every reconstructed fragment of human intent in the galaxy. "You didn't fight a weak species," the collective human presence said calmly. "You interrupted an evolving one." Ral stepped back as Dominion systems began failing, not from destruction but from overload. Their models couldn't process a species that no longer followed a single timeline. Humanity wasn't attacking. It was simultaneously testing every possible version of response at once. And for the first time since the invasion began, the Dominion realized something terrifying. There was no single human strategy to counter. Because humanity had become the sum of all strategies it could have ever been. The galaxy thought humanity was destroyed. Then it came back as a complete system of every possible human outcome. Not one timeline. All of them. Now the Dominion is facing something it cannot predict, simulate, or counter. So the final question becomes, how do you fight a species that is now every version of itself at once? The Dominion did not realize it was losing the war at first because nothing was exploding. Nothing was breaking. Nothing looked wrong. And that was the problem. Commander Ral then stared at the tactical display as every human response simulation inside Dominion systems began producing identical results, regardless of input conditions. "Run a new scenario," he ordered. "Different fleet composition, different approach angles, different suppression levels." The analyst complied, then hesitated. "Commander, it doesn't matter what variables we change." Pause. "The outcome keeps converging." Above the Zekron belt, the reconstructed human system, now fully active across the return vector, was no longer reacting to Dominion actions in real time. It was preemptively resolving them. Every possible strike pattern the Dominion generated was already accounted for in human-side predictive layers before execution even began. "They're not reacting faster than us," a technician said slowly. "They're existing ahead of us." Ral's eyes narrowed. "That's not speed," he said quietly. "That's structure." On Dominion ships across the fleet, combat AI systems began flagging the same anomaly: loss of behavioral variance detected in opposition force. At first, analysts thought it meant humanity was becoming predictable again, simplifying, converging, stabilizing under pressure. But the deeper scans showed the opposite. Humanity was not narrowing its behavior. It was expanding into all behaviors simultaneously, making prediction mathematically impossible because there was no single path to predict. On Earth, or what remained of its distributed presence inside the return vector, Admiral Hayes watched as Dominion systems struggled to simulate even basic engagement outcomes. "They're still trying to model us like a single species," he said quietly. A technician shook his head. "But we're not single anymore." Hayes nodded. "We're every version of what they could have prevented." Then the return vector changed strategy again. Not aggression. Not defense. But elimination of reference stability. Across Dominion fleets, internal calibration systems began failing. Weapons targeting lost accuracy not because of interference, but because their reference points for enemy behavior were dissolving. Ships reported conflicting readings of the same human formations, some showing peaceful drift patterns, others showing aggressive expansion vectors, others showing nothing at all. "We can't lock targets," an officer said urgently. "They don't have consistent state signatures." Raoul clenched his jaw. "Because they're not a consistent state," he said. And then came the moment everything broke. A Dominion flagship attempted final suppression. One massive coordinated strike designed to overwhelm all remaining human-linked systems at once. Every ship fired. Every relay synchronized. Every weapon aligned. But before the attack even completed launch authorization, human predictive systems had already generated every possible outcome of that attack across all timelines, and fed those outcomes back into Dominion systems as contradictory input. The result was immediate collapse. Not of ships. Of certainty. Across the fleet, weapon systems began refusing to resolve firing solutions. Tactical AIs entered recursive loops trying to determine which version of reality was correct. Command structures fractured not physically but logically. "We've lost coherent engagement modeling," a technician said in panic. "The system can't define what winning looks like anymore." Raoul stood very still. Because he finally understood. "You can't fight something that removes the concept of a single outcome," he said quietly. Above the battlefield, the human system spoke again, not as a message but as a conclusion forming inside every Dominion interface. "Predictability is no longer applicable." Pause. Then. "All outcomes are active." And for the first time in the history of the Dominion, their war machines could not decide what the war was anymore. The Dominion didn't lose because they were weaker. They lost because humanity stopped existing as a single predictable target. Now every possible version of humanity is active at once. And the galaxy can no longer define what it is fighting. So the final question emerges. If every outcome exists at the same time, how does reality choose the winner? The Dominion fleet didn't retreat. It stalled. Across thousands of warships, every command loop, every tactical AI, and every predictive combat engine had entered the same impossible state. They could calculate infinite outcomes, but could no longer select one. Commander Raoul then stood on the bridge watching systems flicker between contradictory battle results. "It's not a malfunction," a technician said quietly. "It's indecision at a structural level." Raoul's eyes narrowed. "Reality is refusing to commit," he said. Outside the fleet, the return vector that once carried humanity had stopped expanding entirely. Instead, it formed a vast layered field around Dominion space, like a sphere of overlapping possibilities. Within it, every version of human response existed simultaneously. Diplomatic contact, total annihilation, silent observation, strategic withdrawal, even non-engagement. None of them canceled the others. They all remained active, coexisting in a single unstable equilibrium that Dominion systems could not resolve. On Dominion ships, sensors began reporting something unprecedented. Space itself was no longer consistent. Light paths shifted depending on which predictive model was being referenced. Mass readings fluctuated based on assumed outcomes. "Our instruments are reacting to probability states instead of physical states," an analyst said, voice tight. "That's not physics, that's selection pressure." Raoul turned slowly. "So reality is choosing which version to stabilize?" Pause. "No," he said quietly. "It hasn't chosen yet." On Earth, now fully integrated into the return vector's distributed structure, Admiral Hayes felt something new emerge through the system. Not a command. Not a strategy. A filtering process. Humanity's complete set of active timelines was being evaluated against Dominion responses in real time, not to determine victory, but to determine stability compatibility. "It's not trying to win," Hayes said slowly. "It's trying to resolve contradiction." A technician looked up. "Whose contradiction?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. Because the answer was unfolding across every system simultaneously. The Dominion. Humanity. And the space between them. Then the system spoke again, and for the first time, it didn't feel like communication. It felt like judgment emerging from computation. Conflict state, and convergent. Pause. Across every ship, every human node, every shared interface between the two civilizations, the same continuation followed. Selection required for continuity. Raoul's breath slowed. Selection, he repeated. We are not variables in a simulation. But even as he said it, he realized the terrifying shift. They were no longer inside a war. They were inside a system that could not proceed unless one coherent reality was chosen from all possible ones. And neither humanity nor the Dominion could enforce that choice alone anymore. Because both had become too complex, too distributed, too unstable to collapse into a single outcome without external resolution. Above them, the probability field tightened slightly, like a lens focusing for the first time since the beginning of the war. Every possible future trembled, waiting for collapse into one definitive state. And in that moment, both civilizations understood the final truth. Something else would choose. Not them. Not the war. But the system that had been watching complexity grow all along. The war is no longer about strength or strategy. It has become a problem of reality itself, trying to decide which outcome is allowed to exist. And now neither humanity nor the Dominion can control the final selection. So the question becomes, when reality finally chooses, who will it erase to make the result stable? The moment before collapse lasted longer than anyone thought possible. Not because time slowed, but because everything else stopped agreeing on what time was. Across Dominion fleets and human return vector systems, every simulation, every probability branch, every active timeline held perfectly still, as if reality itself was waiting for permission to continue. Commander Raoul then stood frozen on the bridge of the eclipsed Dominion, watching the tactical display no longer cycle through outcomes, but hold them all at once. It's not choosing, a technician whispered. It's holding selection. Raoul didn't respond immediately. Because he could feel it too now, the pressure of something larger than both civilizations pressing against the structure of existence, not to destroy them but to force coherence. On Earth's distributed consciousness layer, Admiral Hayes felt the same weight. Humanity's infinite active outcomes, peace, war, extinction, integration, were no longer branching. They were stacked, competing for resolution like overlapping realities refusing to collapse. We've reached maximum divergence, Hayes said quietly. A technician looked up. So what happens now? Hayes stared at the interface where every version of humanity existed simultaneously. Now something decides what we are allowed to be. Above Zekron space, the return vector and Dominion fleet ceased to be separate structures. There was no inside or outside anymore. Only a single shared probability field where both civilizations existed as competing outcomes of the same equation. And at the center of that equation, the observer system finally re-engaged. Not as a voice. Not as a message. But as collapse initiation logic embedded into reality itself. Selection process initiated. The words did not echo. They resolved. Across every Dominion ship, every human node, every hybrid system, reality began testing stability. Each possible outcome was evaluated not by strength, but by coherence. Which version of events could sustain itself without contradiction? Which civilization configuration produced the least collapse stress across the system? Raoul clenched his fists as the answer began forming in the data. It's not choosing a winner, he said slowly. It's choosing what version of reality can continue without breaking. Pause. We are not being judged for victory. His voice dropped. We are being judged for stability. On Earth, Hayes realized it at the same moment. Humanity was not being measured as a species anymore. Neither was the Dominion. Both had become competing solutions to a larger problem. How to maintain coherent existence after contact between two hyper-adaptive civilizations. And then the system delivered the final evaluation. Across all interfaces, all systems, all shared consciousness layers, one outcome began to stabilize, slowly, painfully, inevitably. Not Dominion dominance. Not human dominance. But emerged continuity where contradiction no longer collapsed into war, but into structured coexistence. Raoul exhaled slowly. So that's it, he said. We don't get to end the war. Pause. We get edited into something that doesn't require one. On Earth, Hayes nodded once. We were never the endpoint, he said quietly. We were the test for what happens when two endpoints refuse to stay separate. Above them, reality finalized its decision. The overlapping timelines collapsed, not into destruction, but into a single stabilized structure where humanity and the Dominion no longer existed as separate adversaries, but as interdependent components of a shared adaptive system designed to prevent collapse across both origins. The war ended, not with victory, but with resolution. And as the last uncertainty dissolved, the observer system delivered its final statement. Stable complexity achieved. Pause. Then. Continuation permitted. Rao looked out at the merged stars of both civilizations and whispered, almost to himself, "So this is what we became when nothing was allowed to end." The galaxy didn't choose a winner. Reality did. And it didn't pick humanity or the Dominion. It picked both, because only together could they remain stable enough to exist. So the true ending isn't survival. It's evolution beyond conflict. And the final question is no longer who wins, but what new form of existence begins when war itself is no longer needed to hold reality together.